Hey, Laura.
Hey, what's up?
Hey, okay. Hey, Mike.
Just got all my tabs all
Hello.
over.
Happy belated Happy New Year.
Yeah, happy Lunar New Year, everybody. Right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That way we're on time.
Yep, right on time.
Yeah. Yeah, I forget who I was talking to, if it was you, Nicholas, maybe, but I haven't, not that I'm like really hardcore about New Year's resolutions or anything, but I like kind of like to think about it. And then I haven't even done that for this year yet, and January is almost over. So as far as I'm concerned, it's still 2022.
I like that logic.
Yeah, so just everybody calm down. It's not 2023 yet because I haven't moved on.
Let's give it one more minute for folks to show up. I think, Laura, you are driving our agenda today.
I truly am.
You are.
I have so many thoughts to share. All discombobulated different thoughts, though.
Well, that's awesome. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. And it looks like I can share my screen, so I will just prepare that over here. All right, let me know when it's time.
All right, I think we're probably good. So thanks everyone for joining us today at the Tuesday, January 24th SIG Multicluster meeting. Laura, you have the con.
Hey, okay, I wanted to give a few updates about some various initiatives going on, and then I wanted to ask 2 questions about MCS. I'm trying to get the act together here, especially for voluntary API review. So I just want to make sure I have all my ducks in a row for that. So that might be a little bit discussion-y. But first, maybe I'll start from the top and go down because the first ones are more kind of updatey. So first off, I wanted to talk a little bit about the SIG MC website. So talked a little bit about this a couple meetings last year, end of last year, but Nicholas has been helping me, and Mike, I think, also produced some content as well for this site that we're working on, kind of in the spirit of Gateway API site, to just get some more high-level documentation and outreach for the initiatives of SIG Multicluster. So I did actually LGTM a ticket to create the official repo. So we're about ready to migrate over the work that we've been doing now into something that will be like, we can properly DNS against like sigs.k8s.io and stuff. The latest preview is still visible here. You'll see there's some holes. One is for the homepage, so hard to write. But a couple updates besides some of the new content that's in here is that we are going to use basically the like blog, or we maybe we'll change it to the word announcements to kind of have some of the big stuff that goes out on the mailing list also covered in this format too. So it's a little bit easier for people to discover. So we straight up, just copy and pasted what was in the mailing list announcement regarding KubeFed in this case. But yeah, okay. Nicholas has even more updated information, which is great. So this is our our real for sure repo, Kubernetes-SIG/SIG Multicluster site. The repo is here. So now it's a matter of us migrating that over into here, and especially in the format that we want it. So to that point, I'd love for anybody's eyes on some of the content here for how to say, like, for information, like sort of content architecture, if it makes sense to you, and if the content is at the right level of specificity, etc. There is a list of known sort of cleanups still to do, which is being tracked in here because me and Nicholas are working really closely together on this right now, and before it had like an official repo. But if anybody, is interested in collaborating on this, definitely feel free to reach out. If nothing else, your editorial eye is appreciated on the proposal site. This one, Laura Lorenz, GitHub / blah, blah, blah proposal. And then I consider it blocking to make sure that the homepage is done, and like any little tiddly bits we don't really want to be there are hidden, that aren't like finished before we migrate the repo over, so that when it's on the official, site. So that's what's going on with SIG-MC website. Nicholas, did you want to add anything else?
Yeah, just to make sure that everything is up to date. So I saw that there was an official calendar that has been posted. So I included that in a PR that you probably merge tomorrow.
Excellent.
And
yes.
I've also, I've done the introduction webpage yesterday. I
great.
put a PR also on this, so we'll probably review that tomorrow.
Okay.
So just wait a couple of days, I guess, for everyone to review stuff, and and we'll move forward with the rest, I guess.
Cool. All right, awesome. I will merge those changes after this meeting. So for people who want to, who haven't already read it a couple times, want to give it a look and see how it all looks, and DM either of us or post in the Slack if you see something missing, or comment on the doc that has like all the to-dos and proposal. Any of the send a pigeon, anything will do in terms of just letting us know how we can make this look all spiffy before we migrate it over. So that's what's going on there. Any questions, concerns, comments about the SIG-MC website project? Cool. Okay. Next topic. Also, sometime end of last year, but not for a couple meetings, we were talking about the MCS end-to-end tests. And for a while at the end of last year, we were talking about end-to-end tests on the first hand because they are a blocker to moving MCS into beta. And on the other hand, because there's interest among the SIG to extend the testing concept, not necessarily for the graduation requirements, but to make it easier for implementers to know if their implementation is conforming to the upstream standard or not. And so we had a couple side meetings. We determined a while back to kind of take that offline and talk about it. And we have this doc, which is pretty detailed now about what we want to do. So if people are interested, definitely give it a read. But in short, as kind of mentioned before too, the idea is to give something that implementers can use to determine, am I meeting the criteria of the upstream spec? And today we don't feel like the current end-to-end tests really do that very well. There are a couple guiding principles in here regarding the end user experience, like how to make those test failures contextualized to where in the spec you are deviating, and making certain types of things easily configurable so you can test this at different levels of scale, and timeouts that make sense for your implementation. So hopefully all my emojis and stuff make sense in here too for people who are taking a look. But where we are now is how to really do this section. So we discussed what we wanted to do. So the current step we're working on is the basically POC phase. So in a world where we have a larger system where we can expose these messages that are contextualized to the spec and provide this level of parameterization, and most importantly, support a matrix of different cases. Because one thing we discovered when we were talking about this was that, we want 2+ clusters, where n can be a large number, to check headless where local service exists, and exported services are available not in every cluster, right? So that's like one path, but then like non-headless where local service exists and it's available in the exporting cluster, and all these types of combos. We want to see if we can find a way to make something that makes this easier. I see people are talking about maybe not hearing me, but some people still can't hear me. Sorry, distracted by chat. So yeah, that's the sort of sophistication level that we want to get these tests, which is kind of separate from the end-to-end tests, and they're inspired by, but kind of a different model and a different end user than the end-to-end tests that the CAP graduation requirements are tied to right now. So Stephen, Kit, and I are working on some POCs for this and coming together on that hopefully before the next meeting. We have something tentatively on the books for next week to sync up. But I wanted to give the update and make sure everybody knew like where we're going, what the direction is for these tests. And ultimately, again, the point is to make it so that every implementation like Submariner, GKE, AWS can run against this test suite and get really detailed feedback, or the best feedback we can give about where the gaps are for the spec. So yeah, take a look at this doc if you're interested. And again, me and Stephen are in our corners thinking about how to make this work from an implementation perspective that doesn't become too burdensome to make all of those different combinations of tests that we want to support. But yeah, feel free to contact if you have some ideas or interest in this project, interested in this type of composable testing framework. Would love to hear about any prior art as well. Any questions, thoughts, feelings, excitements about the conformance testing suite update?
Excitement.
Cool.
I think it's great to see this happening, and yeah, like kind of once the framework itself is in place and there's like a list of tests that we want written in Gateway API, we've actually found that's a great accessible on-ramp for new contributors to be able to write conformance tests. So
yeah, totally. And I think there's like another meta level later of the conformance / like integration of how to say, previously in this meeting, we've discussed how when you want to do multi-cluster with Kubernetes, there's like now a growing list of CRDs and other tooling you put together, Gateway API and MCS being examples, and they even have their like own potential integrations with each other. So being able to compose something on top of all of that, I feel is like going to be a big problem for us if we don't like do something about it, because we just can't write inline tests for all of that and expect any of that to stay together. So cool.
yeah, this seems great. I'm excited about it.
Great. Yeah. So anyways, again, any prior art or thoughts or whatever, feel free to ping in the doc or send a carrier pigeon or whatnot. And hope to keep updating you, hopefully next meeting with some more deets. Okay, so those are the more updated ones. And then two things I have some sort of questions or discussion point for the group. And this is kind of because I'm gearing up for MCS API review. And just to remind everybody, there's an API review process by which things which use names like Kate's, that use like the domain kates.io, need to undergo. MCS API is actually not in this category because it's out of tree and is using an xkates.io API group, but there was some interest in undergoing a voluntary API review, which is, allowed, not necessarily blocking as a graduation requirement, but just in case. So 2 things that have been coming up in my view is just generally about service import.status. And right now the spec defines something called service import.status.clusters, where clusters is the list of clusters is the list of clusters that contribute to this service. So like if you're in a cluster that has some service import, sorry, my dog's freaking out, that has some service import, and it has like that service is being exported from 2 other clusters like A and B, then this is the list of the clusters A and B, right? I'm curious to know if this is in any implementations now. In general, the service import status, I feel, is not like super well defined. In fact, in the spec itself, it doesn't really say anything, but it is in the API proto, and there's like a comment on it. And one thing I can definitely see it possibly for is there's a suggestion to do endpoint TTL by like establishing leases with other clusters and then checking if you still have connectivity with that cluster, and using that information to decide if you're going to retire some endpoint slices from potentially old backends. But yeah, so I know that was a lot of like details, I guess, because I was recently reading it, but does anybody have some thoughts or comments on service import.status.clusters or just the status field in general for service imports? And is this being used in any implementations today? I see a hand from Kubernetes SIG Multicluster, which I think is Jeremy. Who I can't hear if he's talking. Is it just me? Is anyone else hearing Jeremy? Am I awkwardly talking over him right now?
I can't hear
Oh,
you.
okay, great. I was like, oh no. Okay, I guess he's having a technical difficulty. So.
Oh, yeah. You hear me?
Oh,
Oh,
yes.
it looks like, okay, all it takes is 3 refreshes and the Zoom web client can pick up audio again.
Okay.
I think we
Cool.
may have over specified here. I think we came up with a bunch of use cases. So I guess I think my sentiment's the same as Mike, but I'm using kind of opposite wording. We definitely underemphasized the use of these fields, but I also just don't know that we have solid use cases. Like using them for endpoint TTL is something we never really defined. I think endpoint TTL when a cluster goes away is a very good thing. We should have that.
Right.
I don't know that a given implementation might actually need it the same way. I think this is good info for observability, but I wonder if this isn't just stuff that should be better. I hate doing this, but shoehorned into conditions. When we defined this, I think the idea was that conditions, like basically a status API that consists of 30 different conditions, all custom to each provider, is kind of messy. But
Yeah.
at the same time, if everybody's implementing things in a different way and we don't yet have a solid use case, I'm not as clear if this is beneficial to keep or if it just adds complication.
Yeah. It definitely didn't have, I didn't feel like I had its use case or its motivation well established, certainly in the spec. So I don't know if it will survive API review, but if people were using it or feel that it needs to be there for some other tooling, generic tooling purpose, then I want to check. But yeah, as you say, like, since this is a there's a lot of implementation free reign, especially on the like how the service import got there side. Then especially compared to like the service export, which I feel the statuses are a bit more clear and like we have more jurisdiction to mandate what they are, the service import feels a little less.
Yeah.
So I feel like it could be a bit more clear in the spec how important that is. Even the endpoint TTL part, like in the CAP, it says like this is suggested, not required, but could make it a little bit more clear.
Yeah.
There is not a service export.status.clusters.
Unless we have a clear use case for this, I would be inclined to not. Keep it.
Okay, let me take a few notes here.
Mike, your question is exactly it, I think. If
Like on the surface, like at a glance, it's something, it's like, this looks like a thing that could be useful, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it.
I think that's exactly where we're at.
Yeah, if we don't have a
Okay.
good suggestion, I mean, we have suggestions, I guess, but
I can also look at consoles service import to export. We have a similar concept that bridges across not sameness things that I will see if it has any similar utility like this. I feel like it might. That would help for just like
I would love
adjacent use cases, but I don't want to bloat it if people think it's not necessary.
But we could also always add it later.
if
we see the need.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm speaking a little bit out of turn here because I don't know how we've implemented the controller that we use over on GKE, but I can imagine that from a user's perspective, one point of frustration I have is that when things are broken, it's really hard to find out how. So if this service status.clusters export or import, I feel like it would be more useful in the export, but either way, if this could somehow inform whatever upstream controller that's written to surface that information to me as a user faster and more accurately, it could be useful, but maybe there's better ways to do that.
Yeah, on the service export side, we provide room for conditions, and a specific condition we require is is whether a service export is valid and whether the service export has a conflict. So that type of thing does exist with these two explicitly in the spec defined cases on the service export side. And then I think of the service import side, where we're trapped here is mandating that the clusters are listed in service import with, honestly, we have very little definition right now of how clusters are even supposed to be referred to there. Is that giving useful information for either the MCS controller consuming on the consumer side, or as you're bringing up the end user? And I think we only have maybes for the first thing, like for endpoint TTL, and then we have no for the end user, I think, for this case. But yeah, I'm still open to some ideas on that.
In Submariner? Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Oh,
Sorry, this is Tom. I work with Steven on Submariner.
hi.
We actually do use clusters. Well, we just need a singular cluster ID field. I mean, our implementation currently does not aggregate the service imports imported from multiple clusters, because we need to retain, well, for instance, a certain cluster specific information like the ports, the service ports for our backend. So we do use the clusters field, but it's to communicate the single cluster ID for that cluster that's exporting that slice of the service import. So that said, do we need the field? Not necessarily, but we can always use an annotation that. But now we had some discussions, and maybe this is a side topic. Are we deviating from the spec by not physically aggregating the service imports? Possibly, but our implementation maybe is a little bit different.
Did you say your name was Tom?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Tom. Nice to meet
Hi.
you.
So I think that's actually really good feedback.
Sorry,
Yeah,
say that again, Jeremy.
I think that's really good feedback. I think that suggested is useful. Like, really, if nobody was using it, that's a different conversation. If it's useful, like, I'm happy to leave it in. We just need to define it.
Yeah, it's like I said, we don't technically need it. I mean, we could also, embed an annotation in there to a label as well. But
whenever I hear that, though, I hear that we really need a field. Like annotation APIs in my mind are always just like V1 until you agree to add a field, because otherwise you just have unlimited annotation. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I understood. I mean, like I said, one of the reasons we need that cluster ID field or we use it is a clusters field is because, like I said, we, because the service import doesn't have a provision or doesn't to store cluster specific information like cluster service ports per cluster. So if we were to aggregate, that's one reason. Well, it's probably the reason we don't aggregate is because we need to maintain per cluster information.
Okay, I see. I think you're saying that in the consuming cluster, there's a service import for every that's mirroring every service and of every exporting cluster. So like if 2 clusters were exporting, then there's 2 service imports.
Yes.
Okay.
Per cluster. So, and the service port information isn't aggregator or the union at that point, because we need to communicate the cluster specific service ports. And then on the back end side, that's where we kind of do the in memory, we do the aggregating, the union of the ports and all that stuff. So anyway, but that's our implementation of it. Whether we're not in compliance or conformance or not, but
right,
we might not be. But
I'm suspicious you might not be, but it's also information. You needed it for a reason, obviously.
This use case is built around, forgive me, it's built around .status .cluster more than clusters. Yeah. Like it's about the cluster that the service import exists in. So
yes, exactly that. Right.
All other clusters.
Oh, it's not the other clusters.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Just has one field in it. I mean, one entry because it's the cluster that it comes from. And we're just using that field because it's there. Like I said, theoretically you could use annotation as well, but to do that.
So sorry, is it the current cluster, like the one that the import is in? Or the remote
the one
cluster?
that it comes from. So it's a participating cluster, if you want to call it that, or the constituent cluster that the service is in. So if service is in 2 clusters, then each cluster will import 2 service imports, one from each cluster.
Okay. And it says it says the producing cluster.
The producing cluster advertises out it gets a service import. We then advertise out the service import for that cluster, and everybody imports it.
Okay. Yeah, I think I think if the cluster field is populated with information about the cluster the service import is in right now, then that feels like a use case for about API. But if the clusters field is filled out with not the current cluster, like it's referring to a foreign cluster, then yeah, I think that is a case where it may be that this isn't entirely up to like equivalent with how service imports are defined in the spec, because they are intended to be aggregated and do conflict resolution. But if you have that problem, then we need to figure out where that needs to go.
Well, we could do, we do conflict resolution without necessarily physically aggregating it. But that said, I mean, we certainly would want to be conformant. But for us, I mean, one thing we could do is still advertise the per cluster service import, so we can maintain the per cluster like service port information, but also have an aggregate as well. But
Yeah.
but
I'm
now
seeing,
if the service import had a provision in one of the fields in the status or something for per cluster information, not just what its name is, but also its
Mhm, mhm.
service port information, I mean, that would help our.
Yeah, and I see Steven's comments, because this audio isn't working too, but about this is tied to what ends up in the source cluster label and endpoint slice. Yeah, 100 agree that the usage sounds similar to what the cluster label and endpoint slice is trying to do, where service import is like one unit and endpoint slice has all the per cluster. Like that is the,
Yeah.
you know, where per cluster information is. I think it's interesting that in this case, this field was used as a stopover point. And yeah, I would like to figure out if that is like, you know, meaningful for us to describe in the spec, or is something that we should leave. You know, it's hard for me to tell how hardline we need to be about per cluster information belongs in endpoint slices. Aggregated conflict resolved information belongs in a service import.
Yeah, I mean, if we could, if that priority information go in the
Right.
endpoint, but slice, but, so the other thing with our implementation, and again, maybe this doesn't really match the spec or is
Sure.
completely, is the fact that we don't like create a cluster set wide VIP to represent the service. We actually, each cluster advertises its own. Well, actually, we advertise the actual, if it's a non-headless, then we advertise the cluster IP of the service, or what we call it, a global IP that we might assign, which is for overlapping, to support, overlapping CIDRs. So that's another thing. And again,
Right.
and I think aggregation also assumes that you have a single cluster wide VIP assigned to the service import, which again,
Yeah, because there's one little IP
yeah,
slot.
I mean, it's an array, so I'm not sure why it's an array if
All right, it's flexible, right?
what's that?
It's so flexible.
Yeah. But I mean, the spec kind of says, oh, it's a single although there is one sentence in there, and if I can find it, that is sort of let me see if I have this, if I can find the spec. There is something that says, oh boy, if I can find it. Oh, actually, I just got it. So cluster set IP. So it states that this IP may be a single IP used cluster set wide or assigned on a per cluster basis.
Right. Yeah.
We do
I
the
recall
latter.
that. Yeah.
We do the latter. So now an aggregated, now again, it remains to be seen if an implementation does do the latter like we do, should we just put all the IPs in the list? Maybe that's how we theoretically aggregate. But again, somebody trying to consume that for some, outside of our implementation, how would they be able to consume multiple IPs? I don't know. The spec doesn't talk about that. That's the only thing that says anything about per cluster IPs is that one little blob there, it doesn't.
Right.
The rest of it seems to assume you have a cluster set wide VIP. Anyway, I think maybe we're getting off topic here.
Well, yeah, I think this is interesting.
I will say GKE does per cluster VIP as well. So we've definitely made that okay in the spec.
How does that aggregate? Does it just put all the IPs in the so the spec?
Well, the VIP is for the consumer,
Yeah.
right? The producer, that VIP represents all the endpoints for all the consumers, or all the endpoints for all the producers in a single VIP. But each
for that consumer
participating cluster gets its own VIP.
Yeah, so I think it sounds like on the submariner side, the consumer has many IPs, a VIP for each exporting cluster. But in GKE, it's that the service import has one IP, which is the way out to get to all backends and all other producing clusters. So it's just like where the what am I trying to say? Like in the case of GKE, we don't experience that we need multiple IPs on the consumer side. Okay, so
okay.
I'm trying to track this back to, is there something we need to do in terms of either removing from, simplifying, clarifying, tightening, question mark, what service import dot status dot clusters should or should not be?
It does sound like it's useful, is what I'm getting out of this.
It sounds like something in the service import that can hold per exporting cluster information is of interest, and potentially, to me, it seems the spirit of the spec was that endpoint slice is the land for that. But what I'm hearing is that in practice, service import is at least a stopover for that information, for that per cluster information, metadata, I guess. And up till now, service import has been very simplified in terms of like, resolve conflicts this way. Your service import has one flat scalar value for all of these things after merging everybody. And in practice, we have at least this one case that at the time of making a service import, it's not that flat. That's what I'm getting.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly, I mean, I understand the aggregation and having, like you said, the condense things into a single non-conflicted sort of merged field. And maybe the spec as it stands now serves that purpose, like the spec service ports is merged union and
Right.
result of,
Yep.
but if status or if, you know, I mean, but if the status could, where you could kind of put in some, here's some of the per cluster
A little
information
more.
that made up that decision, you know, the merging decisions in the
Right.
spec, perhaps.
Right. Okay. Okay, let me write that down. Thank you for people who are helping me take notes as I was talking. And consider clarifying the use of per cluster meta per producing cluster metadata in the service import. Right now we keep all of that in the endpoint slice, but it seems there is more use for it. Okay. So I'll try and consolidate some of those thoughts in there. Certainly, I don't think it's clear in the KEP, at least now, like what that status field could or should be used for. And if nothing else, we can keep it kind of at least like that this is where per cluster stuff could go. And then we can see if we need to define that more.
Okay, thanks for considering.
Yeah. And I'll particularly ping in Submariner, it sounds like, for info on that, but other implementations, if you got skin in the game for that, let me know. And I would like to briefly talk about this other point too. So I'm going to change the topic and table that topic for now. So for headless DNS, for headless service right now, you need to know okay, so for a headless service in general, you usually need the host name of the pod to disambiguate which specific pod we want to contact. And then in the case of multi-cluster, we said we also have to include the cluster name, because now you could have pods with the same host name in cluster A and cluster B. So you actually need one more piece of information as a coordinate to find them. You need cluster A dot host name dot namespace, etc. Since then, people have also been thinking about region as a disambiguating feature, and whether this should be part of the DNS spec in general, if this is something that needs to be embedded somehow in the service name or something. And for me, knowing very little about it, I didn't know if this was basically like important enough, I guess, to like have its own sub-label, but there are other cases and increasing cases where regionality is like more of a first class thing, like for like networking purposes, and just in general as a concept, regionality is more of a harder boundary, more similar to a harder boundary. So I just wanted to get people's opinions and thoughts about, and I'm asking very specifically about headless multi-cluster DNS, but I feel like this decision kind of, or whatever, this discussion also applies to just generally how we think about multi-cluster and how we think about what we're setting users up for in terms of the like trust boundary between clusters in different regions. So my most direct concrete thing I want to figure out is whether multi-cluster services headless DNS should leave room for a label in the DNS name for the region that the cluster is in as a required or suggested, these are two options, disambiguating coordinates similar to the cluster name. And then more generally, what people's thoughts are about regionality being kind of like a first class concept within a cluster set for just in general SIG multi-clusters future projects. Mic drop.
Can you guys hear me today?
Oh, now I can hear you. If you were screaming for help before, we didn't hear you.
We'll try this 8th time.
Okay.
In my take, this makes sense. I think the concept of location is pretty core to multi-cluster. I don't know that I would call it region. I think that might be too specific. Just location might make
Okay,
sense.
yeah,
Then
sure.
that could be rack, it could be data center. You know, if I'm thinking on-prem, it could be zone, it could be region. But some regional identification, like location-based identification, makes sense. I think like every cloud, every larger scale platform is going to have some form of tiering where you're going to want to be able to identify subsets in that way.
Yeah, and I want to bring up like there's other like things that can be different about clusters, like if they have like GPU nodes on that, like GPU nodes on them, or operating system or whatever type of things. And I think those are categories we don't think are widespread enough. Like I'm getting the sense, at least in terms of how often location is asked about, that those have a different, those are of like some sort of different tier, I guess. Whereas something like location is at a tier where for both this regional headless, or sorry, for headless pod DNS to be regionalized, or sorry, locationalized, and then maybe future multi-cluster tooling, be aware that this is a boundary that multi-cluster users will always want to respect in some way, then that's something we could potentially take a position on.
So one of the use cases that prevents customers that I'm working with from using MCS and sends them towards the service mesh, for example, is the inability to set a location preference. Like if I'm in zone 1,
Okay.
stay in zone 1 first, unless zone 2 is not. And then if zone 1's unavailable, go to zone 2. But does this network topology sort of make implementing that sort of feature easier? Or is that something that, and please pardon my ignorance, I'm not in the controller code like y'all are, but is that something that's solved elsewhere?
It's not solved in a generic way in the spec. There is a little bit of overlap with, and I would also say it's not solved in a generic way yet for single cluster. There's some progress going on there, topology aware routing, that we overlapped with, but our conclusion with what SIG network has for that right now is that basically multi-cluster doesn't super meaningfully participate, or sorry, multi-cluster services can't super meaningfully participate in it. So yeah, I would say that's more like state of the world today type situation. And then yeah, I think it's really insightful that a blocking aspect for your customers is not being able to express their affinity, their location affinity in a multi-cluster setup specifically. So that's cool. Good to know.
We have a lot of use cases that are coming
Yeah.
up
I bet.
with various levels of locality. And I think like when I'm related to network topology, one of the things that I'm trying to wrap my head around is like there feel like Jeremy put out like zone, region, data center, rack, like there could be various nested levels. Some like within a cluster set, they might be all in the same cloud availability zone, but you would still probably prefer local cluster over a service that is imported from a remote cluster. That's something that we kind of just assumed.
Yeah.
But maybe there's a need for that to be more explicit, or to like respect the cube hints, the topology aware hints. Similarly, like yeah, figuring out like where the boundaries are between like a cluster, like if we're still within the cluster set, if one member of the cluster set is in a different zone, or like if there's a trust boundary across a region. These are all, I think there's a lot here.
Yeah.
it's kind of where I'm at. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's one kind of scary thing about it, because there was like, yeah, one variation of this that's like, okay, well, your cluster name, we gave you 63 characters. So like disambiguate it there, or in your service name, separate out by region and put that in your service name. You have 63 characters there. And then on the other hand, the idea of providing space for like arbitrary subnested amounts of location metadata in DNS is like its own like big can of worms to be opened. But yeah, I think if we can come up, like if we think location in a general sense is something that we probably need to make room for, then I think we need to squabble in terms of future proofing and stuff, what that means today for exposing that in the DNS specification. And you know, that's what I want to figure out most like tactically. But I do feel that, you know, if you're having this experience in SIG network and Gamma and Gateway, and we're having this experience where, you know, once we let people cross these like higher latency boundaries by making these accessible across clusters, then like, is that eventually, is that grounds for this needs to be something that the user has like routing configuration control over, and in our case, the way we would expose that is in DNS. Okay. Steven says they could also be scalability boundaries in terms of the amount of data that needs to be shared across a cluster set. Yeah. So yeah. Okay, this is good first thoughts. Yeah, I think I at first I just need a temperature of like, no, we don't want location. We don't want to get in that no if that was going to be the answer. Or if it was more like, yeah, I do think this is a problem either we have or my customers have, or we're getting proposals for now, or etc. And it feels like it's more strongly on that second point. So I think it needs to be addressed. So probably we'll keep
Yeah.
talking about this a little bit, but I really appreciate the temperature check.
Yeah, can we explore how to, if we can address this at the, that top most flexible level, similar
Yeah.
to the rest? So, like, yeah, location, not region, and like,
Right.
what's the minimum we can define that creates the room necessary for implementers without, adding any constraints?
Right. Yeah, in my mind, it's the options are like do nothing and leave the DNS as is, which I think we don't like. Make another label spot for location where implementers can define whatever DNS whatever sublabel that defines their location. And then I think the most flexible, but then part is to predict on the DNS side if there's like tooling or something, is allow arbitrary number of sublabels to describe a nested location in between cluster name and the service name. So those seem like the three options to me. And I like number 2. And I'm scared of number 3. So that's where I am right now. But I will, I'll make some slides and bring slides next time. How about that?
Awesome, Laura. It
Yeah.
has been too long since we've had.
It has been too long.
slideshow.
I just don't have I didn't have my slide game going, but I'm ready to present slides to SIG Multicluster yet again. Some people in the video seem worried. But yeah, I have a reputation for needing to draw things on slides and not only say them in words. So
Well,
great.
Yeah, maybe
Hey,
we can resolve this next week then, or I guess 2 weeks.
yeah, Mike has a hand.
Yeah, just wanted to like
Mike Morris.
reconfirm for allowing user control over this for DNS. Should we still assume that the sameness principles apply?
Yeah, I don't think we
Okay.
can. I think the sameness holds no matter what. I think it's just more of a question if you need some.
This is a
breakdown
routing.
or
Yeah, this feels like a
regionalization or
routing
something.
question.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Because yeah, I think that makes a big difference between.
Yeah, that's the
how
scope
we
of the
might-
problem we're addressing.
Yeah. Like is the scope of the problem like region wide where it may differ sameness or yeah. Okay, that helps. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that will have to be a different slide deck altogether.
Yeah, sameness for sure. I don't think we want to break that down yet.
And then Tom, were you trying to say something or did I?
Oh yeah, I just one other quick thought on going back to the cluster specific information, and I know I don't have much time, but just a quick idea thought. Perhaps the service import, as it is, could still be the aggregated unified information, but perhaps introduce a service import slice on the side as well. So along the input, I don't know, just an idea, but
Okay,
just in my mind, maybe it doesn't make sense, but it's
we're brainstorming.
brainstorming. Yeah, that's what it is. Just an idea.
Yeah.
That would have the per cluster in say service import information or service import information. That maybe wouldn't be required by the spec necessarily, but anyway, just
Sure.
another thought on that.
Okay. Mike, yeah, let's squeeze you in here in the last 5 minutes.
Yeah, sorry, it's not really about MCS, so maybe I'll wait until you wrap up the MCS. I'll just have a quick comment.
Yeah, I feel wrapped and I'm gonna take these thoughts and try and make some PRs that consolidate them as far as I think they can go. So that, and again, this is all in service of the voluntary API review, but I will tag in people who were discussing this here. And Mike, feel free to give your other topic.
Thank you, Laura. Just could you scroll? Oh, sorry.
I
At the
can.
beginning of the document, we mentioned after KubeCon US, there's talk about like cross cluster controllers,
Yeah.
and then also about multi-cluster control planes. There was some
Yep.
interest from the community. So I wonder if there are any follow-ups on that from either Max or maybe I didn't catch AI. Are there any other interests from the community about that? Like, we would like
Yeah.
to make a presentation about that as well.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest. I think we need to get all of us together, or someone needs to kick off like the discussion thread and pull together some prior art. There's like, it's a bit split between, there's like a Slack conversation, but that got sort of like slowed down after KubeCon. So yeah, all I can really say is there's definitely a lot of interest. I don't think it's the thing that like has the one pager yet, that we can consolidate around. So I think that's the next activation energy step that we need to get this SIG in a position to discuss it. And if you or anybody else has some bandwidth to do it, happy to chat about that. Otherwise, we'll probably get around to it, but it's not like actively being championed yet right now, outside
Got
of
it.
little Slack chats, you know what I mean?
Got it. Maybe I'll start off with another Slack chat and see what their interest is after gathering some feedback. Thank you so much, Laura.
Totes. All right, well, that's all I have to say.
Awesome. This was a great meeting. Happy New Year, everyone, by the way. This is our first time talking. Thanks for the great discussion. It looks like we have some good follow-up. If there's nothing else, I think that's it. All right. Happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday.
We'll talk soon.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.